Dr. Ferranna is a research associate at the Department of Global Health and Population at Harvard University, Boston, Massachusetts. She holds a PhD in economics from Toulouse School of Economics and has previously been a postdoctoral fellow in values and public policy at Princeton. Her work is primarily interested in issues of intra and intergenerational equity, often in relation to environmental and health risks. So she's published extensively in this field, and I just want to draw your attention to two recent papers. One on valuing health impacts in climate policy, published in Health Affairs a few months ago. It's available on the BSEP's website. And prioritarianism and climate change, which I noticed was a preprint that was put online last month. So we're absolutely delighted that Dr. Ferranna is with us today for this second event. So I'll hand over to her now. Just to let everyone know, we will be recording Dr. Ferranna's presentation. In the recording, it'll just be her face and the slides. As soon as she's finished her presentation, we'll stop the recording and then be open to discussion and questions. So we expect her to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then the remainder of the time will be for questions. Okay, so over to you, Dr. Ferranna.
Okay, thank you very much for the very nice introduction. So my name is Maddelena Ferranna, and so what I'm going to do today, if I can move the slides, yes. Okay, so I'm going to focus most of the talk on the main methodology that is used in the climate change literature to evaluate health impacts. And in particular, we'll touch issues such as what is the role of social welfare function in this evaluation, how to evaluate the life in countries that are at different stages of development, and then I will talk a little bit about discounting inequality. And finally, I will end the presentation drawing some conclusions on how this type of approach can also be applied to evaluate any type of health intervention. So let me start with introducing the concept of an integrated assessment model. This type of model is a model that is very used, it's the basic in climate change literature, and it's a model that combines a description of the economy with a description of the climate system. There are two main types of integrated assessment models in the literature. So one type is made to construct scenarios like those of the IPCC scenarios. And that is type of more like engineering type of integrated assessment model. And then there is a second type, which is the type, for instance, for which Stern is famous, or for which Nordhaus has won the Nobel Prize in economics. And I'm going to focus the presentation on this second type of integrated assessment models. So here there is a very simple diagram of such a model. So usually we start with some exogenous assumptions on economic growth, technological progress, and population growth over time in different countries, regions of the world. And then given this assumption, this will affect what will be the production and the consumption in different countries, both today and in the future. And there's an assumption that using the current technologies, these productive activities and consumption activities are going to generate greenhouse gas emissions. And the generation of these greenhouse gas emissions is contributed to climate change. For instance, global warming, but also other climatic changes. And then this is going to have some adverse impacts on society, on economy, on the planet in general. And these climate impacts can be stressed, are going to affect what is the production, the productive activities, and the consumption individuals. And what is the main focus, the objective of this type of integrated assessment model is what is called the social welfare. So the optimal policy is the policy that maximizes social welfare. And I will define social welfare very briefly. And this type of model is used mainly to compute the social cost of carbon. So the social cost of carbon is the monetized value of all the damages caused by just a single ton of carbon. And it's used also to determine what is the optimal carbon policy, for instance, a carbon tax over time. So in the definition of climate damages, most of these climate damages actually are going to be health-related damages. So here I made like a list of a few examples of these climate-related damages. So these are mortality and morbidity impacts that are connected to increased exposure to high outdoor temperatures, for instance, or increased risk of vector-borne diseases, increased poverty, malnutrition, increased risk of extreme weather events like storms or sea level rise, and the mortality that comes from that. And most of these impacts are going to be from medium to long-term impacts. So if any policy is introduced today, we will see some benefits only in a few decades at least, and then in the long term. And then also there is like an expectation that these impacts are going to disproportionately harm those that are already disadvantaged. And with that, I mean poor regions of the world or socioeconomic groups low at disadvantage, like low income socioeconomic groups. And then a third aspect that matters is the fact that some of these impacts are actually going to affect the people at different ages. So if we think, for instance, that mortality, morbidity coming from increased exposure to heat, that is going to affect mainly older people or people at working age that have some jobs made outside, that are done outside. If we think, for instance, in terms of malnutrition, that it's more likely to be a problem for children, for younger people. And so the age structure of the population matters when evaluating these different health impacts. And then there is also like a second type of health impacts that come with climate policies, which are those that are usually called health co-benefits. So these are benefits that are not necessarily related with the climate change itself, but with the fact that any climate policy is going to have some externalities on other issues. So one example is improved air quality. Since the sources of greenhouse gas emissions are also sources of particulate matter pollution, then if any climate policy is introduced, that is going to improve the quality of the air. Another example is dietary changes. So if the policy is inducing a change in the diets of people, for instance, reduced consumption of meat, that is going to have positive impacts on the climate in the future, and that will reduce the climate damages in the future, but it will also have some impacts on the health of the people that are changing their diets. And this second strand of benefits, they are mainly short-term benefits, and also they are localized benefits. So for instance, if China decides to give up completely coal, the benefits of that policy in terms of improved or reduced pollution will be experienced mainly by China. So most of the health impacts are going to be, most of the climate change impacts are going to be health impacts, but there are other damages that are related to climate change. So for instance, agricultural losses, property damages from storms and sea level rise, or reduced labor productivity and biodiversity losses. So what is interesting in the climate change problem is the fact that we have damages encompassing different dimensions, different attributes. And so a question is how to compare these attributes, these different dimensions. Okay, so the approach that is traditionally used in the climate change literature to evaluate any climate policy is a benefit cost approach. And what do I mean with that? So first of all, we usually take a welfarist approach to policy evaluation. Mainly it's a utilitarian approach, according to which an outcome is good only insofar as it contributes to the sum of individual well-being. And these individuals are people that are living today and people that are expected to live in the future. And then there is also a second very important assumption that is made, and that is that individual well-being depends only on a consumption index. And this consumption index encompasses also the value of no-market attributes, so for example, longevity. And if there is any climate damage, any climate change, this climate change is going to reduce the consumption of individuals. And the consequence of that is that all climate impacts are converted into monetary equivalents, independently of whether they are market impacts or no market impacts. And this assumption is made mainly for practical reasons, to facilitate the comparability across different dimensions of benefits and also across different people, people that are living today, people that will be alive in the future, or people living in different countries. And another consequence of that is that there is, in the standard approach at least, so there is an assumption that climate change will have no impact on the number of future people or on the identity of future people. So for instance, there is not this assumption that climate change might induce catastrophic outcomes that will lead to the extinction of the population on Earth. So on one side, we have these climate damages. As I said, they are going to be mainly health-related impacts, and they're going to occur mainly in the future and probably to disproportionately harm disadvantaged individuals. On the other side, we have the mitigation costs that are implied by any climate policy. And these mitigation costs also reduce the consumption index, given that this is the only metric that we are considering. So mitigation costs include, for instance, investments to electrify vehicles or to improve agricultural practices or to build large-scale renewable energy infrastructure. These mitigation costs are usually short-term costs. So here we have a trade-off between the short-term cost of the policy and the long-term benefit, mainly long-term benefit of any climate policy. And also we have to take into account if the climate policy is poorly designed, that might excessively burden disadvantaged populations today. So we have this equity concern not only on the climate damage dimension, but also on the mitigation cost side. And the optimal policy is determined by comparing what are the mitigation costs and the monetary equivalent of the mitigation benefits. But what is interesting is that we don't do a simple sum of the costs and the benefits, but there is an aggregation to a social welfare function. And this aggregation is going to account for inequality in consumption across either generations or regions of the world, or individuals living in the same region, but at different socioeconomic status, for instance. And then the social welfare function might also take into account the timing of cost and benefits, whether they occur in the present or whether they will occur in the future. And so this type of approach can be thought as being equivalent to an equity-weighted benefit cost analysis. So here I use the term equity-weighted instead of discounting. There is a belief that these weights are decreasing over time. And so usually there is always this issue of discounting and consumption discounting in the climate policy. But at the end, it's really an equity-weighted cost-benefit exercise, what is done. And so the question is really, what should be the moral weight that should be attached to benefits or costs accruing either to the present, either to people living in the present or to people living in the future. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, I thought it would be interesting just to have a better look at this social welfare framework and at the main elements of it. So as I was saying, the approach that is taken is a welfarist approach, and most often it's a discounted utilitarian approach. So we usually assume that the discounted utilitarian welfare is basically the sum of well-being, is the total sum of well-being of people living both today and in the future. So it's an intergenerational sum of well-being. So we start with a time period, t equal to 0, that will be like the current period, capital T would be like the maximum length of life on Earth. And this time period is usually thought to be like a decade. So sometimes people think that sometimes there is like an implicit assumption that people living in different decades are different people. So like a generation, that we are changing generation going from one decade to another, that it's not very realistic. Another implicit assumption that can be made is that this social welfare framework is equal to the sum of individual lifetime utility, and individual lifetime utility is just a discounted sum of period utilities, and that individuals use the same discount rate as the social evaluator. This is also not a very nice assumption. It's an awkward assumption to make, because it implies that the social evaluator evaluates policies as much as individuals evaluate their life course. And then we can have different regions of the world or different social group, and we are going to sum the well-being of all these people living in different time periods. And so there is, of course, a discounting term here, what is called a utility discount rate, ROC, which implies that individuals living in the present are going to have more weight in social evaluations than people living in the future. Okay, and then the last term is this well-being function, which is a utility function in this case, and it assumes to be increasing, which means basically that more consumption implies more well-being, and also it assumes to be concave. So concavity of the utility function is going to say that the marginal utility of consumption is diminishing. And this is a very important assumption to make. And what does it mean? It means that if there is one additional unit of consumption given to a poor, that additional unit of consumption generates more well-being than one additional unit of consumption given to a rich person. And the consequence of that, given that the only index, the only metric here is consumption, reductions in consumption are going to be more harmful the poorer the generation or the region or the social group is. And so climate impacts are going to be more harmful the poorer the person or the generation that experiences this impact. And I will refer to this concavity of view as aversion to inequality in consumption, saying that one additional unit of consumption generates more well-being for the poor than for the rich is basically equivalent to say that the social evaluator is averse to inequality, to inequality in the distribution of consumption across individuals living both in the present and in the future. So these two parameters, the time discounting raw, utility discounting raw, and this parameter of inequality aversion are very important and are basically those that drive the results of the climate policy. And so first of all, the larger is this utility discounting raw, then the less the well-being of future people is going to count in the evaluation. And that is going to lead to more lenient climate policy. And of course, there is a huge debate on what should be the value of this raw, with a debate that sometimes is referred as to the prescriptivism versus descriptivism debate. So on the prescriptivism side, there is, for instance, Nicholas Stern, who thinks that this raw should be close to zero, just to represent some exogenous risk of extinction. So that is the idea that, for instance, suppose in 200 years, no person will be alive on Earth. If there is even just a small chance that is going to happen, then maybe we shouldn't care about the impacts of the people that will not be alive at the end. And so if we take this kind of ethical approach, then raw is going to be very small. On the other side, instead, there are people like Nordhaus that think that raw should be based on preferences, on individuals' preferences, revealed in financial markets. And so based on financial markets, we can see that people don't really like to save for the future, or they don't save a lot for the future, let's say, or at least better say, the saving behavior that is elicited in financial markets implies that the chosen raw should be up higher than the one suggested by Stern. And the main consequence is that Stern is, so those that take an ethical approach recommend a very strict climate policy. Those that take instead this market-based approach are going to recommend a less strict climate policy. Then the second parameter that I said that matters is this inequality aversion parameter. The larger the aversion to inequality, what does it mean? It means that the more the well-being of poor people counts. What is going to be the effect of this parameter on climate policy is not completely clear, because it depends on who is going to be the poorest in this intergenerational framework. And because there is a standard assumption of social economic progress despite climate change, such an assumption implies that on average, future people are going to be better off than current people. And so the current generation ends up to be the poorest one, and in particular, poor people living in the current generation. And so if we want to protect their interest, then the larger is inequality aversion, then the smaller the consequence is that will lead to a lenient climate policy as well. On the other hand, if we have to take into account that not everyone in the future is going to be better off than people living today. So we can assume that an average Congolese people in the future might be still worse off than an average American today. And so if we take that into account, and also the fact that climate impacts are progressive, that is going to lead to a stricter climate policy. So that suggests that it's very important to account for inequalities both between regions and also within regions of the world, and for the regressivity of climate impacts and also of mitigation impact, mitigation cost. And really, so what is important is how much climate change is going to reduce this inequality, or how much the climate policy is going to reduce this inequality or increase the inequality. And given that if we add this high degree of inequality in the model, then inequality aversion implies that the more climate change harms the future poor, the stricter the climate policy should be. And on the other hand, if mitigation costs are also regressive, unless appropriate distribution mechanism implemented, then that is going to lead to a less strict climate policy. Okay, so here I took a graph from this paper by Francis Dennig and co-authors that was published in 2015 in PNAS. And these three graphs, they really very nicely highlight the importance of the raw parameter and of the inequality aversion parameter, and also the importance of fully accounting for the inequality in society. So if we just look at the first graph, so the first graph is showing what is the optimal global carbon price over time, starting from 2010 more or less to the future. And this is the carbon price per ton of carbon. So the green line here on the bottom, this is the optimal carbon price that is recommended by Nordhaus. So using this market-based approach to calibrate the social welfare function that Nordhaus suggests, and assuming that there is inequality across regions of the world, but that's the only type of inequality that exists. And so given this assumption about inequalities and given this calibration of the social welfare function, the optimal solution will be very low carbon price in the present that rises slowly over time. Then the second line that is interesting is the violet one here, the purple one by Stern. So here it's the same model that is used in the green line. So again, assuming that the only difference, there is inequality across countries, but that's the only difference in the model. But taking an ethical view on how to calibrate the social welfare function, and in particular assuming that the utility discounting is almost zero. So if we take this assumption, that is going to imply a very high recommended carbon price for the present that rises very steeply over time. And then the other three curves instead. So these are models that take the same calibration as the one suggested by Nordhaus, so the market-based approach. But these are models that introduce further inequality into the picture. And in particular, they assume that there is inequality also within countries. This inequality is represented by distribution of income within countries. And also there is an assumption that climate damages might disproportionately affect the poor. And so the more it goes up, the more these climate impacts are going to be regressive. So for instance, in the blue line here, this is the case in which poor individuals in any country of the world are going to suffer the most from climate change. And so what you see is that just adding this type of inequality, this is going to increase the carbon price. And again, the idea here is that since the poor are going to be affected mainly by climate change, and given that we have this assumption that the social evaluator is averse to inequality, that is going to induce a higher carbon price. And if we had a different model where we take this very high resolution of inequality, and we had the ethical assumption, the ethical calibration by Stern, we would be even more on the top of this curve here. Okay, so let's now have a look at the health impacts of climate change and how these health impacts are evaluated and how they are added to this type of model. So the evaluation of health impacts in the literature is generally done by using the value per statistical life measure to monetize what is the value of climate-related mortality impacts. And here I'm talking about the mortality because most of the literature actually just looks at mortality, given that first of all, because of data constraints, and also because that is going to be the largest health impact of climate change. And this value per statistical life measure is derived from the rate at which individuals are willing to trade off small changes in their income against most changes in their mortality risk. So the VSL is based on individual preferences, and it can be estimated based on individuals' reported preferences or by observing workplace or consumption behaviors. For instance, how much people are willing to get compensated to take a very dangerous job. And just to have an example, if an individual is willing to pay $1,000 to reduce the mortality risk by 0.01%, then the VSL is going to be 10 million. And we can think equivalent to that if we have a group of 10,000 identically situated people, and each of them is willing to pay $1,000 to prevent one death among them, then the VSL is going to be 10 million. And we just basically sum this $1,000 among the 10,000 people. So theoretically, the VSL is based on this individual willingness to pay to reduce mortality risk. And given that it's based on individual preferences, VSL is expected to vary based on individual's characteristics. In particular, the VSL is expected to be increasing in income or in wealth, and that is mainly because wealthy people have also a larger ability to pay for the same risk reduction. So if we take a rich person and a poor person, and both of them are facing the choice of how much they're willing to pay to reduce the risk by a specific amount, the rich person is just going to express a higher willingness to pay just because he's going to have more liquidity. And a second characteristic that might matter, at least in this context, is age, because as I said at the beginning, the health impacts from climate change might differ according to the specific climate change impacts are going to have a different age distribution. And so the relation between VSL and age is actually ambiguous, even though it's often assumed that the VSL of older people is lower because of lower remaining life expectancy. And this relation is ambiguous because it depends also on the consumption or income patterns over time. So given that VSL is increasing in income, if older people have higher income than younger people, then they're going to express a higher willingness to pay to reduce their mortality risk. And so their VSL might be higher. On the other hand, older people are expected to have a lower remaining life expectancy if they're saved from a specific risk. And given that, this is going to reduce their willingness to pay for the same risk reduction compared to a younger person. So there are some estimates of VSL in the literature. These estimates come mainly from developed countries. There is basically no estimate in low and middle income countries. And there are also very few estimates varying by age. So usually in the VSL literature, what is done is just to assume that there is a constant VSL per country, and that this VSL depends on the GDP or the GNI of that specific country. So a solution for the fact that the VSL doesn't, in practice, VSL doesn't vary by age, a solution is to use the value per statistical life year. Then that would be like the value of just an additional year of life. And then to determine what is the number of years of life lost due to climate change instead of the number of deaths due to climate change. And the second assumption that is made is that also the VSLY depends on income, and in particular is a proportional income. So richer countries are going to have a higher VSLY. Of course, the question is that if VSL or VSLY depends on income, that the conclusion is going to be that a life in rich countries is valued more than a similar life in poor countries. And that is, of course, has some ethically objectionable, is an ethical objectionable result. But when we evaluate climate policy, we have this diminishing marginal utility consumption assumption that is going to adjust for that. And why is that? That depends on the fact that because of this assumption, consumption gains in poor countries increase well-being more than the same gains in rich countries. So even if the consumption gains of saving a life in poor countries are lower than the consumption gains of saving a life in rich countries, just because the VSL in poor countries is lower than the VSL in rich countries, because of the diminishing marginal utility of consumption assumption, this saving a life in poor countries might produce equal or larger well-being gains than saving a life in rich countries. And the degree of inequality aversion is going to determine how much more well-being saving a life in poor countries produces compared to saving a life in rich countries. So basically, in conclusion, even though the VSL is going to value more a life in rich countries or the life of rich people compared to the life of poor people, what we are interested in is the well-being impact of that life. And the well-being impact of that life is determined by looking at the implied change in utility. And given this diminishing marginal utility consumption, the presence of this diminishing marginal utility consumption is going to compensate for the differences in VSL and VSLY. Okay. So when I was asked to give the talk, I was told that the main topic of the seminar series is to understand how to set priorities between healthcare and reducing carbon emissions, for instance. So what I'm trying to do now is to see how can we use the approach that I just described to evaluate healthcare interventions. So first of all, I would say that there are three salient features of the approach to evaluate climate policies. First of all is the fact that we are using a societal perspective. So in the healthcare literature, in public health in particular, there is always this question of whether we should take a healthcare perspective or a societal perspective. In the case of climate policy, that's definitely a societal perspective, the one that we are taking. It's not clear to me what would be the rationale of taking a healthcare perspective when evaluating climate change policies. And the main reason is because climate change is going to have so many different types of effects that include different dimensions: health, biodiversity losses, agricultural losses, and so on. And also these effects are going to impact people living in different generations in different countries and belong to different socioeconomic groups, for instance. So the societal perspective really seems to me what should be done. And then in the climate change literature, just for practical reasons, all impacts are monetized. And that is also like one of the differences with respect to standard approaches in health evaluation, where instead you are looking more like at the number of deaths prevented or the number of life years lost averted. So the monetization is really done for practical reasons. So the idea is that everything should be transformed into a single metric, and money is an easy metric, let's say, to use. But even though I don't think there is any example in the climate change literature of that, we could think a different metric. It could be like really years of life, or it could be even just simply well-being, the metric of interest. And then, so the third salient feature is the presence of this social welfare function. And in particular, if we have a distribution-sensitive social welfare function, then inequality in society and inequality in the impacts of climate change and of the climate policy are going to matter for assessing the value of the policy. And this type of approach, that is the use of social welfare function and thinking at how to turn all impacts into a single metric, can be used also for assessing the value of any health intervention. If we think, like, for instance, of vaccination, there has been a call to evaluate what is the full benefit of vaccination. And this full benefit encompasses not only health impact of vaccination, but also the social impacts, the economic impacts, and so on. And A benefit-cost approach is often used in environmental fatality risk regulation and sometimes also in health technology assessment. But generally, there is no adjustment for differences in ability to pay. So the social welfare function element is not added. But of course, we can do better and include this social welfare function element. And the type of comparator result that I'm thinking of here when comparing carbon climate change policies with any health care intervention is, for instance, if we have a carbon tax, is going to create $Y in net value, while a tobacco tax creates $Z in net value. And so in this way, we can compare what is the value of the two policies. Okay, what are the main challenges of using this type of approach? So the first thing is, as I was trying to explain during the presentation, the timing and distribution of health and non-health impacts matters a lot. And so we need to pay attention at when the different impacts of both any climate policy, also of any health intervention, are going to occur. And in particular, take into account that the many health interventions are going to have mainly short-term impacts, while climate policies are going to have mainly long-term impacts. So we need to think at how to compare these two different streams of benefits. Then the second challenge is really how to estimate the value of health or the value of reducing mortality, morbidity risk. If we want to use VSL and VSLY measures, so then the question is how to estimate them. Probably there should be more studies on what is the VSL in low-income countries. And another question is whether, so there is an assumption that VSLY is constant across different individuals at the same income level. Is that a good assumption or not to make? And another challenge of this approach is that a very data-intensive approach, because we need to have information on the distribution of the health and the non-health impacts, and also the distribution of these characteristics without climate change. And finally, we need also data on the correlation between health impacts and background characteristics. So there is a lot of information that is required here that is kind of known in the climate policy literature, but if we want to use the same approach to evaluate other health interventions, then we also need to collect more data on this distribution and correlation. And so finally, just when we think about how to evaluate climate policies, I think there are three challenges that I haven't mentioned, and that are, I believe, are not really well taken into account in the literature so far. So first of all is this idea of endogenous population growth. So climate change might affect fertility patterns, it's going to affect migration patterns, and how to incorporate that into the framework. And then the second, I mentioned that also before, usually the risk of human extinction triggered by climate change is not taken into account. And the last one is, of course, the question of uncertainty. So the framework that I presented so far is like a deterministic framework. We're assuming that we know what will happen in the future. But of course, there is a lot of deep uncertainty when thinking about climate change. And the question is how to evaluate this type of uncertainty, and and how to evaluate health impacts given this type of uncertainty. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to any questions.